It's the second day of the ICCO Global Summit in Istanbul, and I'm joined by Onur Varol, who is Assistant Professor at Sabanci University here in Istanbul. And I know you've given a talk this morning about how misinformation and bot behavior is spreading and developing online. Would you like to give a little more insight into what you do and into what you spoke about earlier today?
So thank you very much again for inviting for this interview. So my research revolves around online manipulation and detection of social bots. So my lab, we call it computational social science lab. We try to bring together expertise of different disciplines. So we closely collaborate with political scientists, psychologists, and computer scientists. And the part of research that we are doing is developing some tools and techniques for identifying misinformation and automated behavior. It involves social bot detection, which I've been doing since 2014, and at that time during my PhD at Indiana University, we developed a tool called Botometer. So in the talk, I introduced Botometer quite briefly, and then show how the automation is actually evolved over the years, because nowadays, instead of focusing on individual accounts, we are more focusing on detecting coordination. And coordination can happen at many levels. Coordination can happen by account interaction, how different accounts amplify or generate content with each other. Or automation can create more realistic content exchanges between politician journalists with the bot accounts. That brings us to study content itself. So we develop techniques for Turkish natural language processing for social media. We have been developing techniques for computer vision, so analyze the context of the images that are posted online. So all these techniques and the data that we collected from social media, we try to understand what it means to have a coordinated campaign, how we can identify it, and to what extent we can measure the impact of such activities.
Okay, thank you. And when we talk about misinformation, how do you differentiate between that which has been organically produced and that which has come specifically from bots?
I mean, there are certain things. So there's even concepts of like misinformation, disinformation, fake news, low credibility news. So the academic literature is quite complex for these different notions. So nowadays we are preferring to use coordinated activities, because some of the misinformation campaigns can grow a little bit in grassroots nature. Maybe the initial seeds of the disinformation can be automated, but once people started to believe those content, then it can sustain itself organically. So in order to identify what it means to have a coordinated campaign driven by the bot accounts, we look at the network topologies, the interaction between different accounts. If they are amplifying the content to an extent that normal humans can or may not interact, that's a signal for us. For instance, we encounter things like the same content being retweeted 40 times by the same account. So on Twitter, what we know is we can only retweet a content once. In order to retweet the same content 40 times, we need to undo the retweet and retweet again, undo the retweet and retweet again. And that's one strategy some bot accounts use to amplify or sustain the visibility of the content. This is just one simple example. Other things are like how they schedule or synchronize in time. So when a politician posts something, there are thousands of bot accounts can retweet and react to the content within milliseconds. That's also quite unusual. So we try to capture those temporal and network topology based signals to distinguish the organic campaigns and inorganic bot driven campaigns.
Thank you. And I know you've done some research into this specifically and into bot behavior. Could you give us some insight into the findings of your research?
Sure. So for social bots, I mean, I've been studying it since 2015. So we developed Botometer for detecting social bots. Then we study, for instance, in 2016 US presidential election. There we came up with different bot behaviors that will help to spread the low credibility information. One of them was bots were quite strategic, who to retweet or who to mention. So for us, it was quite an interesting, because we weren't expecting bot accounts mentioning quite popular individuals. But in US presidential election, what we encountered is Donald Trump many times by mistake or on purpose retweeted misinformation campaigns, some content coming from those accounts. That was quite surprising, because thousands of accounts mentioning Donald Trump or any other popular account, shifting their attention to a particular subject, and one person with millions of followers retweeting it really increased the reach. So that was one thing. Bots were strategically mentioning people. Another one, retweeting the content quite rapidly. So then, as humans, we have this illusion of if something is popular, we are more likely to believe it. So this fake amplification is another thing that we encounter from bot accounts. They make the content more popular inorganically. And the third is being really punctual, like really early on boosting the popularity. And sometimes different accounts play a role. They see its particular individuals gaining a high credibility in the network. And if the content spread by those accounts, that were the other thing. So that was for US presidential election. When we look at more recent events in Turkey, we see lots of fake followers. We develop a one technique tool for automatically identifying those fake followers. We see lots of politicians share those fake followers within their networks. So that was other thing. They look more popular than they actually are, and those bots are helping to disseminate the content. EU laws. One particular EU law is actually made our life a little bit harder, right to be forgotten law. So with the right to be forgotten law, a user can delete a content and we cannot really study those content. And bot accounts really use that content, abuse that law. So they post content, delete it, post content and delete it, make it really hard to study disinformation, misinformation from online social networks, because the platform don't provide these deleted content, which is the most interesting for us. So I think in the recent election, we see more and more of these tactics. And then with generative AI, these bot accounts getting much more smarter. So it is harder to distinguish between at the individual account level what is automated and what is organic. That's why we focus on more coordination. If 10,000 accounts, 10,000 really human-looking accounts retweets the same content in a short amount of time, or they talk pretty much the same way, that for us a signal of automated coordination activity.
And as you said, you've been looking into this since, was it 2015? And so this kind of behavior, malicious misinformation, has been around a very long time, especially in the sort of political sphere. How do you see this sort of behavior developing in the next few years?
I mean, one really quite important and significant thing is the incorporation of generative AI technologies. So it is really hard nowadays to identify at the account level, but the coordination is still a valuable signal. That will gonna continue. That will be still an interesting sample for us. Nowadays, my research team is also thinking different intervention strategies. We try to simulate social networks as real as the actual platforms, and then try what is more effective in mitigation. Maybe we can add or create our own bots to participate in this disinformation campaign, providing some counter arguments, strategically locate themselves in the networks, but doing it at real time is ethically is also problematic. That's why we are first testing those approaches on a simulated environment, simulated social networks, to see what works and what doesn't, and then consider them for the real world scenario, at least to understand the impact of certain campaign and to what extent it will really influence the people's online participation.
And finally, we're sort of seeing this becoming more of a concern for corporations who are worried about attacks on their reputation, for example. Do you have any advice or any sort of, can you give an idea of what companies can do to sort of tackle or combat misinformation?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when we talk about misinformation, we always think in terms of politics. But during the COVID pandemic, we see how the misinformation, disinformation affect the health, public health, and then to what extent it affects the people's lives. So from the company's perspective, it's the same problem. A misinformation campaign can attack certain companies, reduce the credibility of their products or their services. So from the company's perspective, I think it is really important to be proactive, monitoring the early signals of such a campaign from the really beginning, not try to take an kind of like a step forward as the events are unfolding. So maybe it is important really doing the early detection, curating the network, not letting fake followers being part of the network. If that's the case, maybe unfollowing them and kind of like monitoring the activities over the time, what content they share, how people react to it. So kind of like understand their audience better, and then early signals of like shifts and changes in the audience. To me, one good strategy for the company's perspective.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. That's some really interesting insight, and it's been lovely talking to you today.
Thank you very much for having me.